You are listening to the 5 Squared Podcast, the podcast where we bring you tips for your business and your life. Our goal is to leave you smarter with ideas, wisdom, tools, and entertained. The 5 Squared Podcast is produced weekly for your enrichment. Come back often and feel free to add the podcast to your favorite RSS feed or iTunes. You can also follow me on Twitter at 5 Squared and Facebook. All the links are in the show notes. Now let's get started with your host, business consultant, executive coach, and founder of 5 Squared, Tim Fives.
Welcome back, everybody. I hope everybody's had a good week. We've been having a great week here. 5 Squared's cranking. We are cranking. I love it. It's a good time. Good times. Last podcast, we talked about leading and lagging indicators, or key performance indicators. It's great. Good stuff. So check that out if you haven't already. Today I want to talk to you about some implementation strategy things when you're what to look for and things when you're doing your implementations. You're putting a strategy together for system implementations. The first thing, when I go in and look at a company and they're looking for a solution, I desperately try to get them to look at a broader picture of what they're looking at. And the reason I do that is there is a tremendous amount of interaction and integration that happens when you're putting in any particular system. So it's important that we look at those interactions and get a broad view of that. And 9 times out of 10, when you do that, you get a lot of great insights on workflow and processes and things within the organization that may be deficient or could use some improvement. You can bake that into your implementation. It's also a great way, when you're doing that, and the way we do it is via some interviews and reviews and things of that nature, that we start the change management process right then. And there is some danger to doing that, because once you start talking to people, especially as an outsider or third party coming in and having a conversation about systems and possibility, you start to get people excited about the change. So there's a little bit of risk in doing that, but the benefits of getting them engaged early far outweigh that risk. But I'd like to bring that up because it's from the aspect of people who aren't easily moved or they're stuck in their ways. Those interviews and that upfront, getting them engaged, is a great way to start to move them forward along your process along your implementation. So taking those stubborn people and getting them engaged early and often is never a bad thing. Well, I say never, but generally not a bad thing. Then what we do is we look at, in our case, the art of the possible. And I like to do that with clients for a couple of reasons. I really, really enjoy starting to show them, hey, here's what's possible out there. Most companies aren't technology companies. Most companies only have an idea of what's out there. So being able to show them an array of ideas and hone in on a solution is generally key, because it starts to get the juices flowing about, well, how else could we do this differently and better? How could we use this to differentiate ourselves? Hey, I see how that company's doing it. Why can't we do that? Gets a lot of that stuff going in questions and good questions being asked. And then the third thing is starting to hone in on the solution itself for this system. And that's how we start to look at that upfront strategy, right? Engagement, art of the possible, and selection, right? All right, what's the best fit for the company or for the client? And it comes down to a few factors. It comes down to, hey, what can we afford, right? Affordability is there. What's the best thing from a customer experience program, because that's huge these days and it's going to continue to get more relevant. We'll talk about customer experience later, but customer experience is simply how that company's customer interacts with them. So that's got to be baked in as a core tenet of the system strategy. And then you start to look at the implementation itself. Typically what we do is we come up with a roadmap for our clients. And when we do that, we start to say, hey, here's the most important things that need to be tackled to the least. And then those are tied to the key performance indicators of the company, which was in the last podcast. So if you haven't listened to that podcast, go listen to that. because everything that needs to happen within the implementation strategy or software strategy needs to tie back into how am I improving my business. So that's what we look for. And then you get into the implementation strategy. Now, when we look at the implementation strategy itself, we got to look at a few core tenets again. First of that is staff and people. Do they have the right people to do the work? And if they do, great. But there's always got to be somebody there to lead them, and especially when they're doing something new or different. And the reason I say that you've got to have that outside influence in that case is because people always go back to what they know. It's a fundamental tenet. So even though a lot of people come out and they embrace change and they want to do change, they will revert to what they've known because it's human nature. And so you got to have an agent outside of that to take them through it. And the more or the least change ready that people are, the more they're going to regress back to doing what they know, and that's a danger. That's a risk. So that's one of the things that I say. We as a consulting company can help you is be that agent of change. And not do the change, but show you through the change. And I think that's a fundamental thing as you're going forward. And it really comes into play when the project, and every project has its up and downs. But when you start to run into some snags or things gets a little harder or whatnot, that we look at how to keep people focused on the big picture, not just on that issue at hand at that time. And then the final thing is the technology. And I'm working with a company right now, a great company, and one of the things that a lot of tech firms say is, hey, you've got to be technology savvy. You've got to have the best technologists in place. And if you're a technology firm, great, go ahead and do it. But if you're like in say you're a research firm or you're a survey firm or you're, you run a greenhouse, right? You're not a technologist. So I don't always advocate to have a lot of technologists on staff. And I think with the advent of the cloud and the systems in the cloud, focus the business on what they do really well. Get them to know the tool that they're using, but I don't never necessarily expect them to be developers and whatnot. I mean, those are things that for low cost you can farm out, but get them to understand the tool. One of the things I told a client recently was, you've got really good people in here and they're very focused on the task at hand, which is fantastic. They're task-oriented people, but your mid-management, your mid-level leaders need to expand their scope a little bit of what they're doing. So when we start to look at the new tool that we're putting in this instance, we're looking at expanding and getting them trained on the tool, on how to configure it, but most importantly on what the roadmap of that tool is. What new features and functions are going to come out next year that you can absorb into your business that's going to make your business better, right? And getting them to be experts on the tool, but not necessarily the technology. So those are kind of the key components to an implementation strategy that we look at. Again, just to review, we go out and look at the people. We start to ascertain what the pain points are in those interviews. We develop a recommendation. We look at the art of the possible, and then we go into the actual selection of the technology. And then in the implementation itself, we look at the people again, make sure we've got the right people to support the business process in that organization, that the technology supported appropriately. Generally, we look at cloud solutions, so you don't have to worry about networks and servers and things. Not that you don't have to, but not that they're not important, but it lowers the burden for upgrades and things of that nature. And then we go and manage the process implementation within the tool sets selected. That's a little bit about the implementation strategy. Hope everybody has a great week, and find you next time.
Thank you so much for listening to the show with your host, Tim Fives. We hope you will pass along our web address, fivesquared.com, to your friends and colleagues. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. Follow us on Twitter at 5squared or follow us on Facebook. This has been a 5 Squared production. Join us next time for another edition of the 5 Squared Podcast.